Welcome back, everyone. We are continuing our daily coverage of the coronavirus, what it's doing in China, what it's doing around the world. First on the list of stories, we have videos coming out of China from the different funeral homes, and there are people lined up, very long lines, waiting to get the ashes of family members who died from the virus. Now, for those of you who've been following our reporting at Epoch Times, you'll know that actually we were making phone calls into China, and we found that a lot of the cremation facilities, workers there were saying they were operating 24/7 cremating bodies, that there were so many of them. The situation now, it's not clear whether they're still cremating bodies like that. As I mentioned before, the virus situation in China is not over despite the government's claims. But individuals are saying they're not able to get ashes of family members. And we can assume, at least based on my analysis, that that's because they very likely were not keeping the ashes. Situation now, though, is that people are very unhappy about this, because in China, that's a big deal. They have the Ghost Festival coming up. It's the annual time of the year where people pay respect to their dead family members. And so not having the ashes of people who recently died is a big deal for them right now. We're getting interviews on the ground from people in China as well. People are very unhappy with the way the Chinese Communist Party has handled this virus outbreak. They're facing many problems, one being the fact that a lot of them were out of work for several months now. They have not had pay. They have to pay rent still. And as we mentioned in the broadcast yesterday, many of them have to pay medical bills. The situation is very dire. And this is in addition to the point that, as we mentioned in yesterday's broadcast, a lot of people have lost family members. We interviewed one individual who said that he lost 2 of 6 family members within his own household. And he said basically, you go around the neighborhood, there's not a household that hasn't lost someone. And again, this calls into question what the real death toll is in China. Now, we mentioned this number, 21 million, being the number of phone accounts in China that suddenly just disappeared. And in China, again, as I'll mention, you can't just get rid of your phone account. It's tied to your social security number. It's tied to your bank account. It's tied to your health code. You cannot just get rid of your cell phone number. And so a 21 million sudden drop in accounts is a pretty telltale sign that something's not right. Continuing our coverage, China is facing big problems of businesses closing. I mentioned that some of the background of why the Chinese Communist Party right now is claiming that the virus is over in China. I'll retell briefly that history now. Now, if you remember, this was a huge issue in China. The CCP virus was causing, pandemonium, chaos. I mean, the government was warning people about it. Don't go outside, wear a face mask. It was attacking people who didn't wear face masks, you name it. And then suddenly an assessment came out. Found that close to 1/3 of the businesses in China were about to go under. And it said that within a few weeks, another 1/3 of businesses would go under. The Chinese Communist Party was facing economic collapse. And so Xi Jinping, the head of the Chinese Communist Party, came out and said people need to get back to work. And then within a day, Chinese state-run media said the virus is over, it's safe to go back to work. So it went from being huge crisis, pandemic one day, to being over the next. As we've reported here on this show and in Epoch Times, really the situation on the ground, it is not over. People who have the virus were sent home from hospitals. People who go to the hospital seeking care are not being treated. And so the situation is far from over. And as they open things up, early April, for example, they're going to open up Wuhan again finally. You're going to have a lot of people who have been under quarantine who very likely still have the disease, who are going to be very likely spreading it again. China is risking a second wave infection. But again, that brings us to our story right now, which is China is facing big problems of businesses closing, large-scale problem. Number one, because a lot of companies have been out of business basically for the last few months. Number two, because, of course, factory workers haven't been able to go in. Number three, because a lot of foreign countries have canceled orders on a large scale of goods coming from China. There's an estimate that over 80 million people in China may lose their jobs, and a lot of college students now going into the workforce are having a lot of trouble finding work. Now, the Chinese Communist Party is backing off of its attacks on the United States. Now, you may have seen this whole propaganda battle taking place. In China, internal propaganda started saying that the virus spread in Wuhan, but did not necessarily originate in Wuhan. Again, if you're talking about psychological warfare, altering the way people interpret information, it is a battle of narratives. And so what is the narrative? The Chinese Communist Party knew this virus was spreading in China. They knew there was a big crisis, but they covered it up. Doctors who warned about it in early December were arrested, criticized, and silenced by the Chinese Communist Party. People were not allowed to talk about it. This went on until the Chinese Communist Party eventually had to lock things down. And up to that point, early November, they had been lying to the public, saying there is no evidence of human-to-human transmission. The WHO was just repeating everything the Chinese Communist Party said, lying to the world on its behalf. Here we are now, where close to 5 million people left Wuhan before the lockdown happened, and very likely contributed to the spread of the virus all throughout China and throughout the world. We mentioned this UK research paper that came out from a UK university, tracking 60,000 people who left Wuhan. The map they formed shows basically it's a infection map that just perfectly matches the infection rates around the world. And so the Chinese Communist Party came out and said, well, being the fact that this looked very bad for the Chinese Communist Party, came out and internally first started saying, well, this virus is not necessarily from China. It could have come from anywhere. It just spread in China. It's an easy way to shift the narrative. And then they started spreading this narrative externally. Now, and I'd say intensified it internally as well. They started saying the U.S. military brought it to China. This is an American bioweapon. This is what internal Chinese propaganda networks were saying. And then they started broadcasting that abroad. Even the Chinese foreign minister on American Twitter was saying things like this. Suddenly, though, now the Chinese Communist Party is backing off that whole narrative. They're now saying the virus came from Italy. It's the Italian coronavirus, if you were to ask a Chinese propagandist. As things currently stand, though, the main individuals who were very recently criticizing the United States, saying this is an American virus, are now talking about U.S.-China harmony and positive U.S.-China relations. This is, for example, the editor of Global Times, being one of the main state-run Chinese media. Again, right, talking heads, just hand puppets, that's all these guys are. The Czech Republic, meanwhile, is recently confirmed that close to 80% of the Chinese test kits they ordered are non-functional. In other words, test kits that they use to see whether a person has this virus or not are non-functional. This calls into question whether internally in China this means that maybe a lot of people had the virus and got false results from the test kits. You may have seen our previous broadcast where we did show evidence of this, saying that people in China were saying they get tested 8 times and maybe the 6th time it showed positive and every other one was negative. People were questioning even in China how accurate these test kits were. And so the Czech Republic now is saying 80% of them don't work. Spain is also saying the same thing, close to. They're saying 70% are non-functional. The Lancet journal reported that saliva of people who have the CCP virus the saliva is most virulent within the first week of infection, meaning very likely that people within the first week of having the virus are most able to spread it. Again, a reason to stay inside and don't spread the virus if you see symptoms within the first week especially. And the Chinese Communist Party is saying it developed a vaccine and saying it even started human trials, but is now shifting its tone and saying it's cooperating with the United States and the UK to develop a vaccine. And currently there's a race around the world, not just countries but also businesses, to develop a vaccine for this virus. Now, the Surgeon General in the U.S. is warning that the United States could be worse than Italy if people don't follow the guidelines, meaning, of course, respect the lockdowns and also keep in mind the social distancing, 6-foot safety, right? Stay 6 feet away from people. allegedly. And of course, Italy is pretty bad right now. They reported more than 7,500 deaths from this virus so far. The death toll in Spain is also rapidly rising. It's getting close to where Italy is at, in fact. They recorded an additional 655 deaths overnight, bringing the death toll to 4,089 by March 26th. And only about 7,000 have recovered. So now let's move on. The U.S. House of Representatives is voting on a $2 trillion relief package. It was passed by the Senate on Wednesday. The House is now voting on it. Of course, the Senate Democrats initially blocked it. We'll have to see where this thing goes, to be honest. It is, in my analysis, questionable whether Trump is going to sign this thing, mainly because you may have seen reports that the Democrats added a lot of things to it that are not necessary, and I'm trying not to be partisan here, folks, but they added a lot of things to it that don't really relate to the virus itself. I mean, voting requirements, things allowing for, different types of, say for example, banning voter ID laws and things like that. Things totally not related to the virus, they stuffed in there. I guess it's just politics, but when people are facing a crisis that need an answer quickly, you can, if you're a politician, you can easily stuff in whatever you want because people are going to look bad if they say no to passing it. There's a higher chance of it getting passed, and they stuffed a whole lot of things in there. Meanwhile, Trump has approved disaster declarations for Texas and for Florida. And in New York City, the local government here is releasing prisoners. They've released 300 prisoners so far. They're saying they want to release 1,000. This is from the Associated Press. It says, New York City will release more than 1,000 prison inmates due to coronavirus concerns, Mayor Bill de Blasio said Tuesday. According to the New York Post, approximately 300 prisoners in the Rikers Island prison complex and other city facilities will be released this week to limit the spread of COVID-19 through New York City's jail system. De Blasio said inmates chosen are serving less than a year in prison for misdemeanors or nonviolent felonies. And now if you're a New Yorker like myself, you know how the justice system here has been severely gutted, it feels. You see crime in broad daylight here. For example, I'm in Queens. If you go to the local subway stop, not right now because things are kind of shut down because of the virus, but you have people selling swipes for the subways. You have gangs controlling the subway stops here, charging people money to get swiped through the subway terminals. You call the police, they don't do anything. You have guys blocking the turnstiles. That's New York right now. I feel like there's no rule of law here anymore. People have been complaining about de Blasio's handling of law enforcement for a while, and so this just kind of adds to it. And in Canada, the Canadian Free Press is reporting that they are facing a possible food shortage. Canada's agricultural sector is warning of higher prices and potential food shortages if it isn't designated an essential service and allowed to do business as usual during the COVID-19 crisis. Again, this is a big concern, at least for me, because, well, for all of us, I guess. Because again, only essential services are allowed to continue operating. If you're not allowing the food services to operate, the agricultural sectors to operate, there might not be food next season. We take food for granted. We take it for granted that we have a constant, it seems, surplus of available food, but that has not always been the case throughout history. In fact, very recent history in many parts of the world that has not been the case, and even currently in some parts of the world that is not the case. This is a quote from Todd Hames, president of the Alberta Wheat Commission. He said, quote, "We're in unknown territory. We have concerns about potential problems. That's why we need to have governments recognize that farming is an essential service supplying food for the world." Now with that said, now let's jump into the questions from viewers. First question is from Tina Majors. She said, just a thought, could the cell phone cancellations have anything to do with the CCP trying to shut down any information getting out of China? This is again about the 21 million cell phone accounts that were shut down in China recently. Tina, So the question is basically, is this related to maybe the CCP trying to censor information getting out of China? I'd say very unlikely. The Chinese Communist Party has many, many other systems in place to handle that. If it's an issue of people recording on their cell phones and sending the footage, I mean, they can still do that even without cell phone accounts. You can still use your phone without a cell phone account and then just upload the footage somewhere. The Chinese Communist Party is the great firewall. They have all kinds of systems to monitor data and to delete information. You name it, they have ways of tracking you if they can find out who sent what. And so the Chinese Communist Party already has extensive systems in place to try to prevent people from getting information out. Next question from Not a Videographer. Josh, please do a What's on My Bookshelf video. It would be a good semi-diversion. As you can see, if you've been watching our previous videos, I actually rearranged the bookshelf a bit. Previous videos, it was more my daughter's books. Actually, I decided to make this my official bookshelf. I gave her another one. Actually, this is about one of 3 full bookshelves I have here, and then another 2 half ones. I'll go over it briefly. I'll bring the microphone with me. So here, now, one thing you might not know about me is I'm a big fan of classical literature, mythology, and folk tales, and so I have quite a lot of books around those areas. One thing, of course, we do on Crossroads, for those of you who've been following this channel for a while, you know about it, but we have, for example, our Wisdom of Tradition. So here we have the Icelandic sagas, including, in fact, the original sagas of the Journeys to America, the Viking explorers. Amazing book, very, very well worth reading, and it's almost funny how factual they are, especially when writing about things that are kind of hard to believe by our standards. Here we have Italian folk tales, Japanese folk tales. This is an old collection of Chinese poetry that I really like. Here we have the 7 military classics of ancient China. Everyone knows about Sun Tzu and the Art of War. There are fantastic, really incredible military works on China that are very well worth reading. And again, just like Art of War, not necessarily just applied to war, but also to business and to daily life. In my opinion, a lot of the other military classics go a lot deeper. For example, Tai Kung's 6 Secret Teachings is one of the best books you'll read on leadership. It's Alexander Pope translation of the Iliad, which is one of the, well, there's actually quite a few, but one of the better rhyming translations in my opinion. In my opinion, if you want to read Homer, get the rhyming translations. It's not the same if it doesn't rhyme. Alexander Pope has a fantastic version. It's very well done. Celtic myths and legends. I also have the 4 Chinese classic fictions, well, semi-fictions. I guess you call it historical nonfiction to an extent, but also kind of a bit of fiction added in, allegedly. Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Outlaws of the Marsh, Dream of Red Chamber, Journey to the West, the works of Mencius, Creation of the Gods, another Chinese classic. Amazing Tales, Stories Old and New, again, both Chinese classics. And up here I have a lot of the Greek and Roman classics. I won't get into everything I have here because there's too many. But over here then I have a lot of the historical books on communism. Now for those of you who followed me for a while, you know that I do a lot of in-depth analysis on socialism and communism. And the way I like to research history is I don't like to go by interpretations. I would like to go and read it all myself. What I like to do is I like to trace things to their origin and then read books and articles at the time to understand the state of society and then trace the history of it as it, say, changed and evolved throughout the course of history. And so, of course, I have a lot of books talking about early socialism, early communism, even getting into a lot of the older religious movements that helped shape it, such as the Aborigines, the Manichaeans, and so on. Older books, maybe some of them lesser known, talking about the history of communism as it evolved throughout history into what it is now. I do a lot of public speaking, and I've given some presentations on the history of communism. If you are interested in hearing that, let me know. I know in one of our last videos, some readers mentioned the video I did with Chris Chappell on China Unscripted. I did 2 of them, actually, and the first of them goes very much in depth into the kind of ancient history of communism and socialism, how they developed. If you want to see me do a video like that on this channel, let me know in the comments. This is from Nick Dees. He says the hantavirus cases have been reported in the U.S. since the 1990s. By 2001, the hantavirus had been reported in 34 states. It is not unknown. Thank you for clarifying, Nick. Yes, as I mentioned, there is a new virus spreading in China, allegedly the hantavirus. Nick, thank you for clarifying that it is not necessarily a new virus. But of course, what I was referring to is these new outbreaks in China, and there was recently a death, and so people are very concerned about it right now. A couple of you mentioned actually the history of the hantavirus, and so thank you for leaving those comments. Mark J. Kim said, quote, "Great content as usual, but you were out of focus." And yes, my last video, well, not the last one, the one before last, was out of focus. I really apologize, folks. I'm paying closer attention to it. I don't have my film crew with me, so I have to kind of go up and finagle with it myself. So he said that's very important because it's hard to focus what you are saying when the video is out of focus. Yeah, thank you, Mark. Great feedback. I'll really work on that, make sure it's in focus. And lastly, from Rosie, she said that the Chinese have bought out Hollywood and obviously our media. That is treason. And Rosie, I'd have to agree with you. As I mentioned before, close to 30 U.S. publications are running paid inserts of China Watch. China Watch is from it's from China Daily. China Daily being classified in this official foreign mission of the Chinese Communist Party. There was a recent letter from 25 U.S. lawmakers, I think almost all of them were Republicans, who called them out for this, that it was also registered as a foreign agent. And so under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, it is required to disclose payments, it is required to disclose things like this, and it was not disclosing it. In other words, its paid inserts in publications like the New York Times, Washington Post, and so on were being done in violation of FARA, at least according to these lawmakers. So that's a big deal in my opinion, especially when a lot of these publications made such a big deal about Russian disinformation, and meanwhile they're publishing actual paid inserts from the Chinese Communist Party in their newspapers under the China Watch sections. Literal foreign disinformation, getting paid to publish it. Yeah, I think that's a pretty big deal. And as you mentioned too, yeah, the Chinese Communist Party has bought up a lot of Hollywood. A lot of that's been done under Alibaba. Not only have they bought up a lot of the talent houses, not only did they buy up some of the big, or at least one of the big theater chains, but the Chinese Communist Party also puts restrictions and requirements on films and limits the number of films that can make it into China. And so a lot of Hollywood films either self-censor or work directly with Chinese studios to produce films to make sure they're in compliance. This is a big deal. Among those requirements is you can't show the Chinese Communist Party in a negative light, you can't show the U.S. military in a positive light. They're required to show things like have at least one Chinese actor or actress. You need to have at least one shot in China, filmed in China. For the Chinese Communist Party, that's what they classify as culture warfare. Culture warfare being the idea of altering people's perceptions through the use of cultural means. Films, dances, so on. And on the note of dances, everyone's probably seen Shen Yun advertisements. They are absolutely not part of the Chinese Communist Party. They're a New York-based dance group. Of course, Epoch Times is a sponsor of Shen Yun, and they are restoring the culture that the Chinese Communist Party destroyed. And so when I talk about the Chinese Communist Party using culture, don't confuse Shen Yun with that because they're very different. Now, with that said, folks, we're going to be continuing our broadcasts at least 5 days a week. We're going to be doing interviews again pretty soon. As you know, I'm working from home right now. My capabilities are limited but developing, let's put it that way, in terms of being able to do all this, from home. And then, of course, I have external staff who help me out with editing and things like that. I'm also going to be continuing these daily news updates. And so, folks, please, again, remember, like and subscribe. We really need your support. Also, click the notification bell if you're on YouTube. You get alerts when our new videos are up. That said, thanks again, and see you next time.